On April 3, 1996, FBI agents approached a remote cabin in the mountains of western Montana, near the tiny community of Lincoln. The cabin measured 10 feet by 12 feet, had no electricity, no running water, and was accessible only by a rough dirt path through thick forest. It sat on a 1.4-acre plot of land that had been purchased decades earlier for $500, and it had been home to a man who had lived there in almost complete isolation for more than 20 years. The man's name was Ted Kaczynski. He was 53 years old, a former mathematics professor from UC Berkeley, who had walked away from a promising academic career in 1969 and retreated to the wilderness to live a primitive existence, rejecting the modern technological society he had come to view as a threat to human freedom and dignity. He was also, the FBI believed, the Unabomber, the most wanted domestic terrorist in American history, responsible for a 17-year campaign of mail bombings that had killed 3 people and injured 23 others. The bombings had targeted universities, airlines, computer stores, and technology executives, leaving a trail of death and maiming that had consumed enormous FBI resources and terrified anyone whose work involved technology or academia. The FBI had been hunting the Unabomber since 1978, when the first crude bomb exploded at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. The investigation had become the most expensive and extensive in FBI history, involving thousands of agents, millions of dollars, and 17 years of frustration, as the bomber remained unidentified despite leaving increasingly sophisticated explosive devices, and eventually a 35,000-word manifesto explaining his philosophy. When agents surrounded the cabin that April morning, they found Ted Kaczynski emerging from the woods, carrying firewood, looking like any other wilderness hermit, long beard, simple clothing, lean from years of manual labor and a subsistence diet. They arrested him without incident. Inside the cabin, they found a live bomb ready to be mailed, detailed journals documenting every bombing, and the typewriter that had been used to write the manifesto. The Unabomber case was over. The man who had eluded the FBI for 17 years, who had carried out one of the longest and most puzzling campaigns of domestic terrorism in American history, was in custody. But the questions the case raised, about the relationship between genius and madness, about the costs of technological progress, about the nature of terrorism and mental illness, about family loyalty and moral obligation, would endure for decades. This is the story of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. This is the story of 3 people killed and 23 injured by bombs sent through the mail. This is the story of a brilliant mathematician who became convinced that industrial society was destroying humanity and decided that violence was the only way to communicate his message. These are the fatal headlines. Part 1. The Making of a Prodigy. Theodore John Kaczynski was born on May 22, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, to Wanda and Theodore Richard Kaczynski, second-generation Polish-Americans who had married in 1939 and settled in the working-class neighborhood of Evergreen Park on Chicago's South Side. Ted's father, known as Turk, worked as a sausage maker in a local factory, skilled manual labor that provided a modest but stable income. Ted's mother, Wanda, was intelligent, ambitious, and determined that her children would have opportunities she and her husband had not had. Ted was their first child, and from the beginning he was different. He was a quiet baby, solemn and watchful, showing little of the spontaneous joy that characterizes most infants. He rarely cried, rarely demanded attention, seemed content to lie in his crib observing the world with serious eyes. His parents initially saw this as a sign of an easy temperament, but it was the first indication of something more complex. At 9 months old, Ted was hospitalized for an allergic reaction and placed in isolation for several days. Hospital policy in 1943 prohibited parents from visiting sick children extensively, based on the belief that parental presence interfered with medical treatment and discipline. When Wanda was finally allowed to see Ted again, she found him changed, withdrawn, unresponsive, showing none of the recognition or attachment he had displayed before the hospitalization. He had, in her words, become a different baby. Modern psychology recognizes this kind of traumatic separation in infancy as potentially damaging to attachment formation, potentially contributing to difficulties with emotional connection and social bonding later in life. Whether Ted's time in the hospital directly caused the emotional distance that would characterize his entire life is impossible to determine, but Wanda believed it was a turning point, the moment when her son became unreachable in fundamental ways. Ted's intellectual gifts became apparent early. He taught himself to read before starting school, showed extraordinary facility with numbers, and could solve mathematical problems that baffled children years older. His parents recognized his abilities and encouraged them, providing books and mathematical puzzles, proud that their son was so clearly exceptional. In 1949, when Ted was 7, his brother David was born. Ted showed little interest in the new baby, maintaining his solitary focus on books and intellectual pursuits. He was not cruel to David, simply indifferent, as if the presence of a sibling was irrelevant to his interior world. Ted entered elementary school already reading at a high school level. His teachers recognized immediately that he was far beyond his classmates intellectually, and he was advanced through grades rapidly, skipping 6th grade entirely. But while his mind soared, his social development did not keep pace. He made no friends. He participated in no group activities. He was described by teachers as brilliant but odd, capable of extraordinary intellectual feats, but unable or unwilling to engage in the ordinary social exchanges that children navigate instinctively. The Kaczynski family moved to a larger house in the Chicago suburb of Evergreen Park in 1952, and Ted entered a junior high school where his intellectual abilities set him even further apart from his peers. He was younger than his classmates due to grade skipping, smaller physically, and had no interest in the sports and social activities that dominated adolescent life. He was bullied, not severely but consistently, targeted by rougher boys who sensed his vulnerability and his alienation. Ted's response to bullying was withdrawal rather than confrontation. He retreated deeper into mathematics and science, spending hours alone in his room working through advanced textbooks, teaching himself subjects that wouldn't be taught in his school for years. His parents saw his intellectual development as compensation for his social isolation, believing that his gifts would eventually find appropriate outlets in academia where intelligence would be valued over social skills. In 1958, at age 16, Ted took an IQ test as part of a school assessment. He scored 167, placing him in the genius range, well above the threshold for admission to the most selective universities in the country. His teachers recommended that he apply to Harvard, which had a program for intellectually exceptional students. Ted applied, was accepted, and in September 1958 left Chicago for Cambridge, Massachusetts, to begin his undergraduate education. He was 16 years old, intellectually ready for Harvard, but emotionally and socially unprepared for the independence and social complexity of college life. The gap between his intellectual maturity and his emotional development would widen dramatically in the years ahead, with consequences that no one in 1958 could have anticipated. Part 2: HARVARD and the Breaking. Ted Kaczynski entered Harvard in the fall of 1958 as one of the youngest students in his class and one of the most intellectually advanced. He was assigned to Eliot House, one of Harvard's residential houses, where he lived in near-total social isolation. He had no roommate by choice, no friends that anyone could identify, no participation in the social or extracurricular life of the university. He attended classes, returned to his room and studied. His academic performance was extraordinary. He excelled in mathematics, showing a facility for abstract reasoning and complex problem-solving that impressed even Harvard's distinguished mathematics faculty. He was quiet in class but could solve problems on the blackboard that stumped his classmates. His papers were elegant, his proofs precise, his grasp of advanced concepts seemingly effortless. But while Ted's mind flourished, something else was happening at Harvard that would prove profoundly damaging. In his sophomore year, Ted volunteered to participate in a psychological study being conducted by Professor Henry Murray, a distinguished psychologist who had worked for the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA during World War II, developing psychological assessment techniques. The study was titled Multiform Assessments of Personality Development Among Gifted College Men, and it claimed to be examining how highly intelligent young men developed their personal philosophies and values. What the study actually involved was far more disturbing than the bland title suggested. Ted and the other student subjects were asked to write essays describing their deepest beliefs and values. They were told these essays would be discussed in friendly philosophical debates with fellow students. Instead, Ted was brought into a room with bright lights, hooked up to electrodes that monitored his physiological responses, and subjected to what the researchers called vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive attacks on everything he had written. A law student who had been coached to be as aggressive and demeaning as possible would tear apart Ted's essays, attacking his beliefs, mocking his values, belittling his intelligence and personality. The sessions were filmed. Ted's physiological stress responses were recorded. The psychological assault would last for hours, and then Ted would be dismissed to return to his regular life as if nothing unusual had happened. This procedure was repeated weekly over 3 years. Ted would write about his deepest convictions, and those convictions would be systematically demolished in sessions designed to create maximum psychological distress. The electrodes recorded his heart rate, his perspiration, his physical manifestations of emotional trauma. The cameras recorded his facial expressions, his attempts to defend himself, his eventual retreat into silence. The study was, in retrospect, deeply unethical, a form of psychological torture disguised as research. It was never entirely clear what Murray and his team were trying to learn, though there were suggestions that the work was connected to CIA-funded research into psychological interrogation techniques and personality deconstruction. Ted was never fully debriefed about the study's true purposes. He was simply subjected to the procedure repeatedly, and then left to process the experience alone. The psychological impact of Murray's experiment on Ted has been debated extensively. Some researchers believe it was the critical event that transformed Ted from an isolated but nonviolent eccentric into someone capable of sustained violence against strangers. Others argue that Ted's pathology was already present, and the experiments merely accelerated or intensified tendencies that would have expressed themselves eventually. What seems clear is that the experiments violated Ted's trust at a fundamental level, demonstrated to him that authority figures he had been taught to respect would deliberately inflict psychological harm on him, and reinforced his existing sense that the world was hostile and that other people could not be trusted. The experience may have also planted or reinforced the idea that intellectual and emotional manipulation by powerful institutions was a genuine threat to human dignity and autonomy. Ted graduated from Harvard in 1962, at age 20, with a degree in mathematics. His senior thesis was on boundary functions, a topic in complex analysis, and it demonstrated the sophisticated mathematical thinking that would characterize his graduate work. He had maintained a 3.12 GPA, respectable but not exceptional, suggesting either that he didn't care about grades or that his focus on advanced work came at the expense of routine coursework. He had also, by his own later account, begun to hate Harvard and what it represented. The arrogance of the intellectual establishment, the willingness to use people as experimental subjects, the prioritization of abstract institutional goals over individual human dignity. These themes would appear repeatedly in his manifesto decades later, and their origins can be traced to his undergraduate years. Ted entered the University of Michigan for graduate work in mathematics in fall 1962, specializing in geometric function theory. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant graduate student. His dissertation, titled Boundary Functions, was complex and elegant, demonstrating mathematical insights that impressed his committee. He completed his Ph.D. in 1967 at age 25, extraordinarily young for such an advanced degree in mathematics. But his social isolation continued. He had no friends in graduate school, no romantic relationships, no engagement with life outside of mathematics. He was described by fellow students as a ghost, someone who appeared for seminars and then vanished, who could be brilliant in mathematical discussions and utterly unreachable in personal ones. After completing his doctorate, Ted was hired as an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the premier mathematics departments in the world. It should have been the beginning of a distinguished academic career. Instead, it was the beginning of the end of Ted's engagement with the conventional world. Part 3. Berkeley and the Retreat. Ted Kaczynski arrived at UC Berkeley in fall 1967 as an assistant professor in the mathematics department, teaching courses in calculus and geometry. He was 25 years old, recently awarded his Ph.D., and by all objective measures embarking on exactly the kind of career his intellectual gifts had prepared him for. But Ted was profoundly unhappy. He found teaching tedious and unrewarding, interaction with students draining rather than energizing. His lectures were clear and well-organized, but delivered in a monotone that suggested he would rather be anywhere else. Students found him cold and difficult to approach. Office hours were painful for both Ted and the students who attended them. His research continued to be strong. He published papers in boundary functions and related topics that were well regarded by specialists. But he took no joy in the work, experienced no sense of accomplishment or connection to the mathematical community. The life of the mind that had been his refuge since childhood was no longer providing satisfaction. Ted later described this period as one of growing rage and desperation. He was living in a small apartment near campus, working a job he hated, surrounded by the noise and crowding of urban Berkeley, unable to form meaningful relationships, increasingly fixated on the idea that modern technological society was a prison that was destroying human freedom and authentic experience. In 1968, during his second year at Berkeley, Ted became aware of environmental destruction occurring in areas of wilderness he had hiked in during summers. Forests were being clear-cut for development. Roads were being pushed into previously roadless areas. The wild places he had found some measure of peace in were being systematically eliminated by the expanding technological industrial system. This realization seems to have been a turning point. Ted began to form a philosophy that would later be articulated in his manifesto, that industrial technological society was inherently destructive of human freedom and of the natural world, that it could not be reformed or redirected, and that it must be destroyed before it destroyed everything worth preserving. In spring 1969, without warning or explanation to his colleagues, Ted resigned from Berkeley. He was 26 years old, abandoning a tenure-track position at one of the best universities in the world, walking away from the only career path his entire life had been preparing him for. He told no one his plans. He simply stopped showing up to teach, submitted a brief resignation letter to the department chair, and left Berkeley. His colleagues were baffled. Students who had been in his courses found themselves reassigned to other instructors mid-semester. The mathematics department accepted his resignation with regret and confusion, unable to understand why such a promising young scholar would simply walk away. Ted returned to the Chicago area and lived with his parents briefly while making plans. He had saved some money from his teaching salary. His needs were minimal, and he had decided to do what he had been contemplating for years: remove himself entirely from technological society and live in the wilderness. In 1971, Ted and his brother David purchased land near Lincoln, Montana, a remote area in the mountains west of Helena. The property cost $500, a price that reflected its isolation and lack of any infrastructure or development. There was no road access, no water, no power. Just forest and mountainside, and the kind of profound solitude that Ted had been seeking his entire life. With David's help initially, and then alone, Ted began building a cabin. He taught himself carpentry and construction, working with hand tools, using materials he could salvage or purchase cheaply. The cabin he eventually constructed was tiny, 10 feet by 12 feet, a single room with a loft sleeping area, a small wood stove for heat, and minimal furniture he built himself. He had no electricity, relying on kerosene lamps and candles for light. He had no running water, carrying water from a nearby creek. He had no telephone, no connection to the outside world except for occasional trips to the small town of Lincoln for supplies. He grew some of his own food in a small garden, hunted and foraged for supplemental nutrition, and lived on a budget of a few $100s a year. By conventional standards, Ted's life in Montana was one of extreme deprivation, but by his own account, the first years in the cabin were the happiest of his life. He was alone, finally and completely. He was surrounded by wilderness. He was living the kind of authentic, unmediated existence that he believed human beings had evolved for and that technological society had made almost impossible. He spent his days chopping wood, tending his garden, hiking in the mountains, reading the books he hauled in from town. He taught himself wilderness survival skills, becoming proficient at living off the land, taking pride in his self-sufficiency. He had no obligations to anyone, no schedule imposed by external authority, no compromise required with a society he had come to despise. But Ted's isolation was not entirely peaceful. He was aware, constantly and painfully, that the wilderness around him was under threat. Logging roads were being pushed deeper into the forest. Clear-cutting was expanding. Recreational vehicles and motorized trail bikes were invading previously quiet areas. The industrial technological system he had fled was following him, destroying the wilderness he had sought refuge in. And Ted was angry. The anger that had been building since Harvard, since the psychological experiments, since Berkeley, since his entire life of alienation and frustration, was finding a focus. The technological industrial system that he believed was destroying everything of value in human life and in the natural world. Sometime in the mid-1970s, Ted decided that retreat was not enough. If the system was going to destroy the wilderness, he would fight back. And the weapon he would use was the one his education had best prepared him for: his intellect applied to the construction of bombs. Part 4. The Bombing Campaign begins. The first Unabomber device was discovered on May 25, 1978, in a parking lot at the University of Illinois, Chicago Circle campus. It was a crude package bomb addressed to Professor E.J. Smith at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, with a return address for Professor Buckley Christ at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Neither professor had sent the package. When the package was opened by university police, it exploded, causing minor injuries. The device was unsophisticated, built from materials available at any hardware store, powered by batteries and a primitive triggering mechanism. It caused more smoke and noise than actual damage, but the intent was clear. Someone was sending bombs through the mail. The FBI began investigating, initially treating it as an isolated incident. But on May 9, 1979, A similar package bomb exploded at Northwestern University, this time injuring a graduate student who opened it. The pattern suggested a bomber targeting universities, someone with a grudge against academia or against specific individuals in academic settings. The investigation was hampered by the lack of forensic evidence. The bombs were designed to be largely destroyed by their own explosions, leaving minimal physical evidence for investigators to analyze. The components were common hardware store items that couldn't be traced. The bomber left no fingerprints, no DNA, no clear signature beyond the devices themselves. On November 15, 1979, the bomber escalated. A bomb was placed in the cargo hold of American Airlines Flight 444 from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The device was designed to explode during flight, which would have killed everyone aboard. But the altitude-triggered mechanism malfunctioned, and the bomb only smoked and smoldered, forcing an emergency landing. 12 passengers were treated for smoke inhalation. The FBI realized they were dealing with someone willing to commit mass murder. This was the bombing that led the FBI to create the Unabomber task force, Unabomber standing for University and Airline Bomber, the pattern they had identified. The task force would eventually become one of the largest and longest-running investigations in FBI history, consuming 17 years and millions of dollars. Between 1979 and 1985, the Unabomber struck sporadically, targeting universities, airlines, and technology-related businesses. The devices became more sophisticated over time, showing the bomber's learning and refinement. Early bombs were crude. Later bombs were elegant pieces of engineering, using wood and metal components handcrafted with precision, designed to maximize damage while minimizing the chance of discovery before detonation. The targets seemed random initially, but patterns emerged. Universities, particularly engineering and computer science departments, airlines and airline executives, computer stores, technology companies. The bomber was targeting the technological industrial system, though investigators didn't understand this yet. The FBI's profile suggested a disgruntled academic or someone with a grudge against universities, but the specific motive remained unclear. On December 11, 1985, the bomber killed for the first time. Hugh Scruton, the owner of a computer rental store in Sacramento, California, picked up a package that had been left in the parking lot behind his store. It exploded, killing him instantly. Scruton was 38 years old, a businessman with no connection to academia, killed for operating a computer store. The bomber then went silent. No devices appeared for 6 years, from 1985 to 1987. The FBI investigation continued, but with decreasing intensity as leads dried up and no new bombings occurred. Some investigators believed the bomber had died or been imprisoned for other crimes. Others believed he was simply dormant, waiting. They were right about the waiting. Ted Kaczynski had not stopped his campaign. He was refining his philosophy, improving his bomb-making techniques, selecting new targets with more care. The silence was preparation, not cessation. When the bombing resumed in 1987, the devices were even more sophisticated, and the targets more clearly ideological. The bomber was now targeting people and institutions he saw as particularly responsible for the advancement of technology and the destruction of freedom. Part 5: Escalation and Death. The Unabomber's return to action in the early 1990s was marked by increased sophistication in both the bombs themselves and the targeting strategy. The devices were now being constructed with extraordinary care and precision, using handcrafted wooden components, carefully selected metals, and triggering mechanisms that demonstrated advanced understanding of materials and engineering. On June 22, 1993, Dr. Charles Epstein, a geneticist at the University of California, San Francisco, opened a package at his home in Tiburon, California. The explosion severely damaged both of his hands and caused injuries to his face and body that required extensive surgery and rehabilitation. 2 days later, on June 24, Professor David Gelernter of Yale University opened a similar package in his office. The explosion nearly killed him, costing him the sight in one eye, the hearing in one ear, and partial use of his right hand. Both men were computer scientists and technology advocates. Their injuries were severe and permanent. The bomber had refined his devices to maximize injury to whoever opened them, using shrapnel and explosive force in combinations designed for maximum human damage. Then, on December 10, 1994, Thomas Mosser was killed. Mosser was an advertising executive in North Caldwell, New Jersey, killed by a package bomb opened in his home. His wife and children were nearby when the bomb exploded. Mosser's death puzzled investigators initially. He was not an academic, not obviously connected to technology in the way previous targets had been. But further investigation revealed that his firm did publicity work for Exxon, and the bomber apparently viewed him as complicit in the public relations campaigns that defended corporate exploitation of the environment. The final murder occurred on April 24, 1995. Gilbert Murray, a timber industry lobbyist, was killed in his office in Sacramento when he opened a package bomb. Murray represented the California Forestry Association, an organization that opposed environmental regulations and advocated for expanded logging. To the Unabomber, Murray personified the destruction of wilderness by industrial interests. 3 dead, 23 injured, some of them maimed for life, 17 years of bombings, and the FBI was no closer to identifying the bomber than they had been in 1978. They had forensic evidence, components from the bombs, materials that had been analyzed in detail. They had a profile developed by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. They had thousands of tips from the public, but they had no suspect. The investigation was costing millions of dollars. Hundreds of agents were assigned to the case at various times. Every bombing generated new leads that had to be followed, new suspects who had to be cleared, new theories that ultimately led nowhere. The bomber was disciplined, careful, and apparently invisible. What the FBI didn't know was that the bomber was living in a 10-by-12-foot cabin in the Montana wilderness, working alone, constructing bombs with materials purchased from hardware stores using cash, leaving no paper trail, no connection between his life in Montana and his bombings in California, Illinois, New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Ted Kaczynski's life in Montana had settled into a routine that combined the primitive simplicity he valued with the complex intellectual work of constructing bombs and formulating his philosophy. He would spend months at a time without seeing another person beyond brief trips to Lincoln for supplies. He lived entirely outside the technological system he despised, proving to himself that such existence was possible. But the bombs were his message to that system. Each device was a statement, carefully crafted, sent to targets he had selected through extensive research. He read newspapers and magazines at the library in Lincoln, tracking developments in technology and industry, identifying people and institutions that he saw as particularly harmful. He would research potential targets, sometimes for months, before deciding to strike. The construction of each bomb required weeks of careful work. Ted made most components by hand using simple tools and materials. He kept detailed notes on each device's construction, recording techniques that worked and those that didn't, refining his approach with each iteration. The bombs became more sophisticated not because Ted had access to better materials, but because he was learning from each attempt, applying his mathematical and analytical mind to the problem of creating effective explosive devices with minimal resources. Part 6. The Manifesto. On June 24, 1995, The New York Times and the Washington Post each received a letter from someone claiming to be the Unabomber. The letter offered a deal. If one of these newspapers would publish a manifesto, a long essay explaining the bomber's philosophy and motivations, the bombing campaign would end. If they refused, the bombings would continue and intensify. The letter included a code that only the bomber would know, details about previous devices that had never been made public, proving that the offer was genuine. The FBI and the newspapers faced an unprecedented dilemma. Should they give a terrorist a public platform in exchange for a promise to stop killing? The manifesto itself, titled Industrial Society and Its Future, was approximately 35,000 words long, a densely argued philosophical and political tract that explained the author's views on technology, freedom, and modern society. It was sophisticated, coherent, and deeply radical in its conclusions. The document began with the thesis that the industrial technological system had fundamentally damaged human freedom and psychological well-being. Technology, the manifesto argued, created artificial needs and dependencies that enslaved people to the system. Modern humans were cut off from the authentic experiences of subsistence living, forced into specialized roles that prevented genuine autonomy, subjected to constant psychological pressure and manipulation by advertising and social engineering. The manifesto argued that the system could not be reformed. Technology's advance was driven by forces that individuals and even governments couldn't control. Each new technology created problems that demanded new technological solutions, creating a self-perpetuating cycle that could only end with either the collapse of civilization or the complete subordination of human life to technological imperatives. The only solution, the manifesto concluded, was revolution, the complete dismantling of industrial society, and a return to simpler, small-scale communities where human autonomy could be genuine. This revolution would require violence, because the system would never voluntarily surrender power. The bombings were the beginning of that necessary violence, an attempt to inspire others to join the fight. The manifesto was carefully reasoned and extensively footnoted, referencing academic sources and contemporary social critics. It showed a mind capable of systematic philosophical thought, someone who had read widely in social theory and environmental philosophy. But it also showed psychological disturbance, the rage beneath the academic prose, the absolute certainty of its conclusions, the willingness to kill strangers to advance an abstract ideology. The FBI and the Department of Justice debated for weeks about whether to recommend publication. The arguments against were substantial. Giving a terrorist a public platform rewarded violence, potentially encouraged copycats, and violated the principle that terrorism should not be allowed to achieve its goals. The arguments in favor were pragmatic. The manifesto might contain clues that would help identify the bomber, and if publication genuinely ended the bombing campaign, it would save lives. In September 1995, Attorney General Janet Reno and FBI Director Louis Freeh recommended publication, and on September 19, 1995, the Washington Post published the full manifesto as an 8-page supplement. The New York Times shared the publishing cost, but the Post printed it. The publication was controversial and remained so. Some argued it was a necessary compromise that led to the bomber's capture. Others argued it set a dangerous precedent, showing that terrorism could achieve publicity and force major newspapers to publish material they would never normally consider. What the FBI hoped was that someone, somewhere, would read the manifesto and recognize the writing style, the ideas, the particular voice of the author. It was a long shot, relying on chance and the possibility that the bomber had shared these ideas with someone before deciding to express them through violence. The long shot paid off. Part 7. The Brother's Burden. David Kaczynski was 7 years younger than his brother Ted, born in 1949, when Ted was already a child prodigy being groomed for Harvard. Growing up, David had idolized Ted, seeing him as brilliant and principled, someone who had chosen to live according to his values, even when that meant rejecting the conventional path to success. David knew that Ted had gone to live in Montana, that he was living a primitive existence in a cabin, that he rejected technology and modern society. They corresponded occasionally, letters written by hand, since Ted refused to use email or telephone. The letters discussed philosophy, environmentalism, the problems of industrial society. Ted's views were extreme, but David saw them as the logical extension of environmental concerns that many people shared. When David read the manifesto published in the Washington Post in September 1995, something troubled him. The phrasing, the arguments, the particular way ideas were expressed, it sounded like Ted. David tried to dismiss the thought. His brother was living in the woods, not building bombs. Ted was a pacifist, someone who rejected violence. It couldn't be him. But David couldn't shake the resemblance. He found some of Ted's old letters and compared them to the manifesto. The similarities were striking. Certain unusual phrases appeared in both. The structure of arguments was identical. The manifesto's discussion of freedom and technology echoed things Ted had written to David years earlier. David shared his concerns with his wife Linda. She read the letters and the manifesto and agreed. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. David was facing the most agonizing decision of his life. If Ted was the Unabomber, he had killed 3 people and injured 23 others. He might kill again. David had information that could stop the bombing campaign, that could bring a terrorist to justice, that could prevent future deaths. But acting on that information meant turning in his own brother to the FBI, knowing that Ted would likely spend the rest of his life in prison or be executed. David struggled with the decision for months. He consulted with Linda, with a trusted therapist, with an attorney. He considered trying to convince Ted to turn himself in, but the attorney advised that any direct contact might alert Ted and cause him to flee or destroy evidence. The only option, if David believed Ted was guilty, was to go to the FBI. David's attorney contacted the FBI in February 1996, providing copies of Ted's letters and raising the possibility that Ted Kaczynski might be the Unabomber. David asked for assurances that the death penalty would not be sought if the information led to Ted's arrest and conviction. He wanted his brother stopped, but he didn't want to be responsible for his execution. The FBI analyzed the letters and compared them to the manifesto. Linguistic experts conducted detailed comparisons, finding hundreds of similarities in phrasing, word choice, and argumentative structure. The evidence was compelling enough to obtain search warrants. On April 3, 1996, FBI agents surrounded Ted's cabin in Montana. They found Ted outside, carrying firewood, and arrested him without incident. Inside the cabin, they found exactly what they needed: a completed bomb ready to mail, detailed journals documenting every bombing, bomb-making materials and components, the typewriter used to write the manifesto, and thousands of pages of writings expressing the same philosophy as the published manifesto. The evidence was overwhelming. Ted Kaczynski was the Unabomber. The 17-year manhunt was over, and it had ended because a brother had made the most painful decision imaginable, choosing public safety over family loyalty, knowing he would carry the weight of that choice for the rest of his life. Part 8: The Trial and the Plea. Ted Kaczynski was indicted on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and transportation of explosive devices with intent to kill. He was held in the Sacramento County Jail while the prosecution built its case, and the defense team, led by federal public defender Quinn Denver, attempted to mount a defense. The evidence against Ted was overwhelming. The cabin had yielded a mountain of incriminating material: the completed bomb, the journals describing each attack in detail, materials and components matching those used in the devices, and the typewriter that forensic analysis matched to the manifesto. The linguistic analysis comparing Ted's letters to the manifesto showed hundreds of unique phrases and constructions appearing in both. Witnesses could place Ted near some of the locations where bombs had been mailed. The defense team faced an impossible task. They could not argue that Ted hadn't built and sent the bombs. The evidence was incontrovertible. Their only viable strategy was to argue that Ted was mentally ill, that his actions were the product of paranoid schizophrenia or some other serious mental disorder that rendered him legally insane, or at least diminished his responsibility. Psychiatric experts hired by the defense evaluated Ted and diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. They argued that his belief system, that industrial society was conspiring to destroy human freedom, that he needed to act violently to stop it, was delusional, that his isolation in Montana was a symptom of mental illness rather than a lifestyle choice, that the manifesto was the product of a disturbed mind rather than a rational political philosophy. Ted rejected this defense completely. He did not believe he was mentally ill. He saw himself as a rational person who had correctly analyzed the problems of modern society and had taken logical action in response to that analysis. The idea that he was insane was, to Ted, both false and insulting, a way of dismissing his ideas without engaging with their content. This created a profound conflict between Ted and his defense team. The attorneys believed the insanity defense was the only way to save Ted's life. Without it, the prosecution would seek and likely obtain the death penalty. But Ted refused to cooperate with a defense that characterized him as mentally ill. He wanted to represent himself, to present his political philosophy to the jury, to have his ideas judged rather than his mental state. The trial was scheduled to begin in November 1997, but as the trial date approached, the conflict between Ted and his lawyers intensified. Ted filed motions to dismiss his attorneys and represent himself. The judge was reluctant to allow this, believing that Ted would be unable to mount an effective defense and that the trial would become a platform for his ideological manifesto rather than a proper legal proceeding. Prosecutors, meanwhile, were concerned that a lengthy trial might result in jury nullification or mistrial, and that the psychiatric defense might create reasonable doubt. They also knew that David Kaczynski's cooperation had been contingent on a promise that the death penalty would not be sought, though that promise wasn't legally binding. In January 1998, as the trial was about to begin, prosecutors offered a plea deal. Ted would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. No trial, no opportunity for Ted to present his philosophy publicly, but also no death penalty. Ted was torn. He wanted the trial, wanted the public platform, wanted his ideas heard. But he also understood that the alternative was likely execution, and that representing himself against a murder charge with overwhelming evidence was a path that ended with lethal injection. On January 22, 1998, Ted accepted the plea deal. He appeared in court and pleaded guilty to all charges, acknowledging responsibility for the bombings, the deaths, the injuries. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences totaling 30 years. Ted was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, the federal supermax prison where the most dangerous and high-security prisoners are held. He would spend the rest of his life there, in isolation, cut off from the natural world he had valued, and from any possibility of continuing his campaign against industrial society. Part 9: Supermax and Death. ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado where Ted was sent after his conviction, is designed for isolation and control. Prisoners are confined to their cells 23 hours a day, with 1 hour of solitary recreation in a concrete yard. Contact with other prisoners is minimal. Contact with the outside world is heavily restricted. The facility is sometimes called clean version of hell by those who have worked there. For Ted, who had valued wilderness and solitude, the isolation might have seemed tolerable initially. But the isolation of a prison cell is fundamentally different from the isolation of a Montana cabin. In Montana, Ted had been alone by choice, surrounded by nature, free to walk in the forests and mountains. At ADX Florence, he was alone by force, surrounded by concrete and steel, denied access to everything that had made his Montana life bearable. Ted settled into prison life with the discipline he had always shown. He read extensively, taking advantage of the prison library's substantial collection. He wrote prolifically, letters to supporters, additional essays on technology and society, correspondence with academics who were interested in his ideas. He maintained his refusal to engage with modern technology, avoiding any use of computers or electronic communication. He also became a figure of interest to certain elements of the radical environmental movement and anti-technology activists. Some people, particularly those in the anarcho-primitivist movement, viewed Ted as a martyr, someone who had sacrificed his freedom to strike against the technological industrial system. They published his writings, analyzed his philosophy, and held him up as an example of principled resistance. Ted received substantial correspondence from these supporters, and he responded to many of them, continuing to develop and refine his ideas about technology and freedom. His manifesto was republished multiple times by different groups, distributed online and in print, studied by political theorists and environmental activists. Whether this was the outcome Ted had hoped for when he demanded publication is uncertain, but his ideas achieved far wider circulation after his arrest than they would have if he had remained unknown in Montana. But Ted's imprisonment also meant the end of his capacity to take direct action. Whatever revolution he had hoped to inspire through his bombing campaign had not materialized. Technology continued to advance. Industrial society continued to expand. The wilderness areas Ted had valued continued to be developed and degraded. His bombs had killed 3 people and injured 23 others, but they had not slowed technological progress even slightly. Ted's brother David, meanwhile, carried the burden of having turned him in. David wrote a book, Every Last Tie, about his decision and the family dynamics that led to it. He became an advocate for abolition of the death penalty, arguing that his willingness to turn in his brother had been contingent on the promise that Ted would not be executed. David also established a foundation to provide financial support to victims of Ted's bombings, trying to make some restitution for the harm his brother had caused. The question of Ted's mental state remained contested. The diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia that defense psychiatrists had provided was rejected by Ted himself and disputed by other mental health professionals who argued that Ted was rational, just deeply misguided in his conclusions. The distinction matters legally and philosophically. If Ted was mentally ill, he was a sick person who needed treatment. If he was rational, he was a terrorist who deserved punishment. In the years following his conviction, Ted's health declined. He suffered from various ailments associated with aging and with the stress of long-term solitary confinement. But he remained intellectually active, continuing to read and write, maintaining his identity as a philosopher and critic of modern society rather than as a criminal. On June 10, 2023, Ted Kaczynski was found dead in his cell at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, where he had been transferred due to declining health. He was 81 years old. The cause of death was reported as suicide, though the exact circumstances were not publicly disclosed. His death prompted renewed discussion of his legacy. Some viewed him as a domestic terrorist whose violence had been unjustified regardless of the validity of his critique of technology. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a brilliant mind driven to madness by isolation, and by genuine concern for the destructive effects of industrial society. Still others, particularly in anti-technology movements, continued to view him as a prophet whose warnings about technology had been prescient, even if his methods had been wrong. Part 10. The VICTIMS REMBRED. 3 people died as a direct result of Ted Kaczynski's bombs. 23 others were injured, some of them permanently maimed. These victims deserve to be remembered not as abstractions in a case about terrorism and philosophy, but as individuals whose lives mattered independent of the man who ended or damaged them. Hugh Scruton was 38 years old when he was killed on December 11, 1985. He owned Rentec Computer Rentals, a small business in Sacramento that rented computers to people who needed them temporarily. Hugh was picking up a block of wood that had been left in the parking lot behind his store, not realizing it was a bomb. The explosion killed him instantly. Hugh was described by friends and family as kind, passionate about his work, excited about the possibilities that computer technology offered for education and business. He was exactly the kind of person Ted's ideology targeted, someone who saw technology as beneficial and who helped spread its use. But Hugh was also a real person, someone with family who loved him, friends who valued him, employees who depended on him. His death left a hole in all those lives that was never filled. Thomas Mosser was 43 years old when he was killed on December 10, 1994. He was an advertising executive with Young and Rubicam, working from his home in North Caldwell, New Jersey. His wife Susan and their infant daughter were in the kitchen when the package bomb exploded in Thomas's home office. Susan ran to him, but he died before help arrived. Thomas had no obvious connection to technology companies or universities. His firm did public relations work for Exxon, and Ted apparently viewed him as complicit in corporate environmental destruction. But Thomas was a father, a husband, a professional trying to provide for his family. His daughter Kelly would grow up without a father because of Ted's abstract ideology. Gilbert Murray was 47 years old when he was killed on April 24, 1995. He was a timber industry lobbyist, president of the California Forestry Association, advocating for the industry's interests against environmental regulations. Ted saw him as an enemy, someone destroying wilderness for profit. Gilbert saw himself as defending jobs and communities that depended on forestry. Gilbert was killed in his Sacramento office when a package bomb exploded. He left behind a wife and family who had to process not only the grief of loss, but the knowledge that he had been murdered for his work. The bomb that killed him was sophisticated and carefully crafted, demonstrating Ted's skill and his complete lack of concern for the human cost of his campaign. Among the 23 injured, some suffered life-altering wounds. Dr. Charles Epstein lost most of the use of his hands, catastrophic for a scientist whose work required manual dexterity. He underwent multiple surgeries and years of rehabilitation. Professor David Gelenter lost sight in one eye, hearing in one ear, and partial use of his right hand. He was a computer scientist who had written about the potential of computers to enhance human life, and he was maimed by someone who saw that vision as a threat. Others survived with less visible but no less real trauma. John Hauser, a graduate student at UC Berkeley, lost parts of several fingers in a 1985 bombing. Gary Wright, a computer store owner in Salt Lake City, was injured by a bomb in 1987. Diogenes Angelakos, an engineering professor at UC Berkeley, was injured in a 1982 bombing. Janet Smith, a secretary at Vanderbilt University, was injured in 1985. Each of these people had lives that were disrupted or destroyed by bombs sent by a man they didn't know, for reasons they couldn't have anticipated. They were not soldiers in a war they had chosen to fight. They were civilians going about their ordinary lives, working jobs, pursuing education, running businesses. The psychological impact on survivors and victims' families extended far beyond physical injuries. The knowledge that someone had deliberately constructed a device designed to kill or maim them, had targeted them for abstract ideological reasons, had invested weeks or months in preparing to harm them. This knowledge created trauma that persisted long after physical wounds healed. Some victims became advocates for various causes after their recovery. David Gelernter wrote about his experience and about the nature of terrorism. Some family members became involved in victim advocacy organizations. Others simply tried to rebuild their lives privately, carrying the burden of what had happened without seeking public attention. What united all of them was that they had been victimized by someone who saw them not as people but as symbols, as representatives of a system he wanted to destroy. Ted's manifesto spoke of the need to attack the technological industrial system, but the system doesn't bleed, people do. The 3 who died and the 23 who were injured were the real-world cost of Ted's philosophy translated into action. Part 11. Psychological Analysis and Ideological Questions. Ted Kaczynski's case presents some of the most complex questions about the relationship between mental illness, ideology, and violence in the history of American terrorism. Was he a mentally ill man whose paranoid delusions drove him to violence, or was he a rational extremist who used terrorism in pursuit of consciously held political goals? The answer matters both legally and philosophically, and it remains genuinely contested. The psychiatric diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia that defense experts provided was based on several factors. Ted's social isolation from childhood onward, his fixation on the threat posed by technology, his belief that he needed to take violent action to combat this threat, and his apparent inability to recognize that his actions were morally wrong. These experts argued that Ted's manifesto, while coherent in its surface logic, was fundamentally a delusional document, the product of a mind that had lost touch with reality. Ted rejected this diagnosis completely and consistently. He argued that his isolation was a choice based on his values, not a symptom of illness. He argued that his analysis of technology was accurate, supported by evidence and by the writings of legitimate social critics. He argued that his actions were necessary given the magnitude of the threat he had identified. He was not delusional, he insisted. He was one of the few people willing to see clearly and act accordingly. The debate is complicated by the fact that Ted was, by any objective measure, highly intelligent and capable of sophisticated reasoning. His mathematical work at Berkeley was genuine scholarship. His manifesto, whatever its moral failings, is a coherent philosophical argument that engages seriously with real issues about technology and freedom. He lived successfully in primitive conditions for decades, demonstrating practical competence and discipline. This combination, brilliant intellect, coherent ideology, capacity for practical action, combined with willingness to kill strangers for abstract goals, doesn't fit neatly into categories of either mental illness or rational criminality. Ted was not hearing voices or experiencing hallucinations. He was not disconnected from reality in the sense of being unable to distinguish fantasy from fact. But his moral reasoning was profoundly disturbed. His empathy was absent or suppressed, and his belief that violence was justified was unshakable. Some psychologists have argued that Ted's pathology was better understood as a severe personality disorder. Specifically, schizoid personality disorder combined with narcissistic and antisocial features. This framework explains his social isolation as a lifelong pattern rather than as a symptom of psychosis, his violence as the expression of rage and grandiosity rather than delusion, and his ideology as a rationalization for actions driven by psychological needs rather than as the primary cause of those actions. The role of the Harvard psychological experiments in Ted's development is also contested. Some researchers believe the experiments were traumatic enough to damage Ted's already fragile psychological structure, creating or intensifying his mistrust of institutions and his willingness to strike back against authority. Others argue that Ted's pathology was present before Harvard, and that the experiments merely confirmed beliefs and patterns that were already established. What seems clear is that the experiments violated Ted's trust at a formative moment, demonstrated that respected institutions would deliberately harm individuals for abstract research goals, and reinforced his sense that he couldn't rely on conventional social structures or authorities. Whether this was causative or merely reinforcing remains uncertain. The ideological content of Ted's manifesto also deserves serious analysis separate from the question of his mental state. His critique of technology is not entirely wrong or unique to him. Many philosophers, environmentalists, and social critics have raised concerns about technology's effects on freedom, community, and the natural world. Writers like Jacques Ellul, Ivan Illich, and later Kirkpatrick Sale developed arguments similar to Ted's about technology's autonomous development and its threat to human autonomy. What distinguished Ted from these other critics was not the content of his analysis, but his conclusion that violence was necessary and justified. Most critics of technology advocate for regulatory approaches, for democratic control of technological development, for lifestyle changes and social movements. Ted concluded that these approaches were futile, that the system was too powerful to be reformed, and that only its destruction could preserve what remained of human freedom and wild nature. This conclusion was not the result of mental illness in any straightforward sense. It was a moral and strategic judgment, albeit a profoundly wrong one. Ted believed that killing a few people to prevent what he saw as the enslavement or destruction of humanity was justified by utilitarian calculation. He was wrong morally, strategically, and practically. His bombs didn't slow technological development. They didn't inspire a revolution. They killed 3 people and injured 23 others without achieving any of his stated goals. But the wrongness of his conclusions doesn't mean they were delusional in the clinical sense. They were the conclusions of someone whose moral reasoning had become completely disconnected from normal human empathy, whose abstraction of ideas had reached a point where individual human lives became acceptable sacrifices to ideology. This is a pathology, certainly, but it's one that has appeared repeatedly in history in people who are not diagnosably mentally ill. Revolutionaries, terrorists, zealots who conclude that their cause justifies any means. Part 12. Final Aria Felicitiones. Ted Kaczynski died in federal custody on June 10, 2023, at age 81, having spent 25 years in prison for a campaign of terrorism that killed 3 people, injured 23 others, and consumed 17 years and enormous resources in one of the most extensive manhunts in American history. His life was, by any measure, a tragedy, but a tragedy of a complex and disturbing kind. He was born with extraordinary intellectual gifts, raised by parents who recognized and encouraged those gifts, educated at the finest institutions America could offer. He had every advantage that privilege and merit could provide, and he used those advantages to build bombs and kill strangers in service of an ideology that ultimately achieved nothing. The victims deserve to be centered in any final accounting. Hugh Scruton, Thomas Mosser, Gilbert Murray, 3 men who died because a hermit in Montana decided that their work made them legitimate targets. Charles Epstein, David Gelernter, John Hosser, Gary Wright, and the others who were maimed or injured, who carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives because they were unlucky enough to open a package or be in the wrong place when a bomb exploded. These victims were not casualties of war, not combatants who accepted risk. They were civilians murdered or maimed by someone who appointed himself, judge of which lives were worth preserving and which could be sacrificed. Ted's manifesto spoke in abstractions about freedom and technology, but the bodies and the wounds were concrete and specific and irreversible. David Kaczynski's decision to turn in his brother remains one of the most agonizing moral choices in modern American history. He chose public safety over family loyalty, knowing that his brother would spend the rest of his life in prison, knowing that he would be viewed by some as a betrayer. Whether that decision was right is not a question with a simple answer, but the courage it required and the burden it imposed are undeniable. The question of whether Ted was mentally ill or simply evil is one that will never be fully resolved. The evidence supports both interpretations to some degree. What seems certain is that Ted's pathology, whatever its source and nature, involved a profound disconnection from normal human empathy, an ability to conceptualize people as abstractions rather than as beings with inherent value, and a willingness to cause suffering in service of ideas that ultimately proved futile. The manifesto's critique of technology continues to be read and discussed, divorced from its author's violence. Some of its arguments are legitimate topics of ongoing debate in environmental philosophy and social theory. The fact that they were articulated by a murderer doesn't make them automatically false, though it should make readers cautious about embracing them uncritically. But the manifesto's conclusion, that violence against the technological system is necessary and justified, was profoundly wrong and must be rejected absolutely. Technology does raise genuine questions about freedom, community, and environmental sustainability. These are important debates that deserve serious engagement. But terrorism is never the answer to philosophical disagreements, and murder is never justified by abstract ideology. Ted's life in Montana before the bombing began showed that it is possible to live outside technological society to a significant degree. He demonstrated that a person with minimal resources can survive in primitive conditions, can reject modern convenience, can maintain autonomy from the industrial system. But his turn to violence transformed him from an eccentric hermit into a domestic terrorist, destroyed any positive legacy his wilderness existence might have had, and guaranteed that his ideas would forever be associated with murder, rather than evaluated on their merits. The case also demonstrates the importance of family awareness of warning signs and the agonizing conflicts that can arise when someone suspects a loved one of serious crimes. David Kaczynski's recognition of his brother's writing in the manifesto and his decision to contact the FBI likely saved lives. But it also destroyed his relationship with Ted and left David carrying a burden that he would bear for the rest of his life. For law enforcement, the case demonstrated both the importance of persistence in long-term investigations and the value of asking for public help even when doing so involves risks. The FBI's decision to recommend publication of the manifesto was controversial, but ultimately led to the break in the case that 17 years of traditional investigation had not produced. The case raises questions about academic and research ethics that remain relevant. The Harvard psychological experiments that Ted participated in were conducted with minimal oversight and informed consent. Whether they contributed to Ted's violence cannot be definitively established, but they represent a category of research that would not be permitted under modern ethical standards, and their legacy continues to generate debate about the treatment of human research subjects. Ted Kaczynski's death in 2023 ended a life that had been defined by isolation from childhood to incarceration. He was never part of normal human community, never formed the kinds of intimate relationships that give most lives meaning, never found a way to channel his intellectual gifts into anything constructive. Whether this isolation was chosen or compelled, whether it was symptom or cause of his violence, it was the constant theme of his existence. The wilderness he valued continued to be developed and degraded after his arrest, just as it had been before. The technology he opposed continued to advance. The industrial system he attacked continued to expand. His campaign achieved nothing but death and suffering. This futility, more than the moral wrongness of his actions, might be the most important lesson. Terror